Hi, this is Misha. Kind of revisiting the Walther guns now that we've been using the new camera and mic for a bit now. We did a video on the PP and PPK, then we did one on the pre-war and wartime P38, and this one will kind of wrap up with the post-war P38s and their variants. So on the table we have an SVW 1945 French production P38, often known as the Grey Ghost. Then we have a West German Bundeswehr surplus P1, produced in West Germany. Then we have a West German P4. This is a police pistol used by some police departments in West Germany. This is a surplus police. And finally we have kind of a famous little gun, the P38 K4 Curves. This is a commercial Interarms import, but these were used in limited numbers by a few West German military and police officers. These are all very similar guns because the theme here is the post-war period. Also brought out a post-war leather P1 holster. This is essentially the same as the later war so-called soft shell holsters introduced in 43 and really brought in 44. Has a storage compartment on the side for a spare mag. Pull. Pretty standard holster. And then the later synthetic holster made of the Flecktarn camo, which also holds a mag on the side here. It's basically the same pattern of holster, just made of a different material with kind of a felty type interior. A neat holster, except these weren't attached to a standard belt. They were meant for German web gear. That's why they're not terribly popular in the US and very cheap, because you really can't use them as a holster, whereas this, you know, has the belt attachment. You run your belt through it here. Anyway, just thought I'd bring them out to have something else on the table. For the pre-war and wartime history, please check out our video on that. And also, if you want to hear more about my personal feelings and things, we have a story time episode dedicated to me and Walther's. So let's get going. About 1.2 million P38s were produced during World War II. The majority were Walthers, but a large number, over 300,000, about 325, 330,000, were produced by Mauser. And after the war, these guns were used by many nations. Czechoslovakia, for example, adopted and used the P38 until it was replaced with the VZ52 and other guns. They also saw some use in Poland. Russia captured a large number. Although they didn't issue them, they kept them in stockpiles just in case. Austria, who had been using the HP, the Here's pistol, the commercial version, would use some after the war and acquire others. About 25,000 HPs were made in total, many of them during the war actually. And they would continue to issue the P38 for a very long time, in fact until really being replaced by the Glock. And of course, West and East Germany would use the P38, so on and so forth. Another major user was France. The French captured the Mauser factory, who had been producing pistols with the SVW code starting in extremely late 1944 into 1945, so that most would be marked SVW45. And the wartime production would end in the F serial suffix block. Well, almost immediately the French restarted the factory, producing several guns, Mausers included, but for our video today, we're talking about their production of the P38. They would first assemble guns using all leftover parts, even having the Waffenamt inspector stamping of WA135 still on them. They would use a lot of the late war synthetic kind of soft plastic grips early on in the G block. Then they would go over to these metal grips, which are pressed steel, which Mauser had been working on at the end of the war, but never really put into production. Also, Mauser's guns in 1945 could be virtually all phosphated, and the French would continue this phosphating process, although the coloration's a little different. The German guns tended to have kind of a gray to gray-green hue because of the part process they're using, the tanks, and they were kind of low on certain chemicals. When the French took over, they shifted that when they went into production to kind of more of a darker gray to almost black color, but they're both phosphated. And yeah, they would produce these. A lot of times today we would call them the Grey Ghost. This was a name coined by importer Interarms back in the late 60s, early 70s. The French never really used it. They just called them the P38. They would also give it a couple of different model designations, including 1945. But yeah, this was a 9x19 parabellum pistol. They needed guns after the Germans had ransacked their country, and so they produced a number of these using the captured Mauser factory. It was basically free guns for them. Production was about 50 to 55,000, so very large. And the last guns to be made in the L block, actually the last 500 or so, were not assembled at the Mauser factory. They would be assembled several years later in the early 50s in France. This arrangement didn't last long because the Soviets and others protested that they were using the war material. So although they would roll over to the SVW46 range, very soon thereafter they would essentially bulldoze the factory and scrap it for parts. Now, they didn't just make these guns for export or just because they could. They issued them quite a bit. A number of these wound up in Indochina, today Vietnam, where they were used extensively in the 40s and 50s before the French pulled out. So quite a few ended up in the hands of the Vietnamese, and even some of those were captured by American GIs. So it's a very interesting range. So you could say that Mauser production continued for about a year after the war, thanks to the French and the so-called Grey Ghost. But the most distinctive feature of these being the metal grips on later ones after the first ones were built with the polymer or the plastic grips, and of course the phosphate finish. Quality is every bit the same as a typical P38. They're well assembled. Sometimes they'll have, of course, a lot of late war features like the stamped slide release, and the barrel has some lathe marks, but functionally they're very good and very dependable. The metal grips make them a little heavier and give a little wider grip, which is a good thing for someone with wider hands. And these would stay in service in France well through the 50s and even into the 60s before they were finally sold off as surplus, many of them landing here in the USA and honestly being very affordable for a long time because people, they weren't, World War II Nazi production, so people didn't want them, they wanted something else. Finally, it's worth pointing out that some of these were blued, and these were done for police use. At least that's the common consensus. The phosphated ones are for the for the French army, and the blued ones were French police. And if you saw our PP and PPK video, you know that France would begin manufacturing under license at the Herein factory the other Walther guns brand new in the 50s. They would also manufacture new production P38 types, but that's a story we'll get to in just a second. But yeah, also, if you remember, the Spreewart factory was in occupied Czechoslovakia, and about 100, maybe a few more, a few less, guns were assembled post-capture by the Soviets, the communists. And so you'll find some guns with a 00 prefix serial that were assembled post-war in Czechoslovakia, but they had a lot of guns because of the factory being there. So the P38 would be known as the VZ46 in Czechoslovakia, and would basically be the de facto standard until the VZ52 came into service. Even then, a lot of people still preferred the older P38 because the VZ52 had issues. So there was definitely a lot of post-war use of wartime guns, or at least parts from wartime guns, but eventually that would calm down and we would get to this. Not to repeat myself too much, but after the war, Fritz Walther made it to the west of Germany and opened up a new factory in Ulm, but because of restrictions on what could be produced and could not be produced in West Germany, his factory would make essentially business machines, especially adding machines. Then he would enter into that contract with Herein. But in 1955, it was decided to allow West Germany in the Bundeswehr to rearm and thus start up arms manufacturing again. So by 1957, the factory at Ulm was producing the P38 as a post-war version. These early guns were still marked P38 and were extremely similar to the wartime, but using some lessons learned, Walther would make a few updates. For one, the frame would be made of an alloy mix. As I said in the PPK section, there was attempts at something called a dural frame, a durable aluminum frame, but it wasn't strong enough during the war, so they never went into production. The formula was worked on, and finally they got it right in 1956, and so they would put the P38 into production with an alloy frame. And that in the P38 wartime video, I made a mistake. Sorry, I said that the P38 weighed 28 ounces. That was with the alloy frame. The steel frame version from World War II weighed about 34 ounces, so just under 2 pounds, 1 pound and 3/4, whatever. But when they went to the alloy frame, it lowered that to just over 27 ounces in the late 50s. So quite a light gun, and it honestly makes handling quite nice. Another change, they would return to kind of the checkered style grips of the HP, combining them with the square lanyard loop of the P38, so kind of a hybrid grip. Otherwise, magazines would stay the same, 8 shots. The alloy would be anodized. The metal would be phosphated, although you can find some blued guns. Action is the same. Still have a 4.9 inch barrel. Still about 8.5 inches overall. It's a very, very similar gun to the wartime production. At least the early production ones were. So these were marked beginning in 1957, P38, and were adopted by the Bundeswehr as its standard issue sidearm, later being joined by the famous G3 and so on and so forth. And in 1963, I believe, the P1 designation was actually started to be placed on the guns. So military guns would start to be marked P1 in the early 60s. However, commercial and police guns would still be marked P38, but they would have alloy frames for the most part. There were some steel frame anniversary editions made in 1980s, but story for another day. Now they would do a few changes to make the gun better. One, in 1968, they would introduce a wider slide, what collectors call a fat slide. You can tell this one's a little bit flared out. They would also extend the slide serrations for better grasping. And then a short time later, in the early 70s, I believe it was, 71, 72, they would introduce a reinforcing pin to the frame. This was not really to make the frame itself stronger, but to have the locking mechanism where it cammed, not hitting against the alloy directly, so they put in a hex-shaped pin, so it would be a steel-on-steel lockup and thus keep the service life reasonable on these. These small changes would add not quite an ounce to the weight, so we're a little over 28 ounces again with the P1, but still quite a bit lighter than the P38. Otherwise, the changes were pretty small. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head that's worth mentioning in a video is the serialized parts. Your wartime guns after 1941, getting into 42 and onwards, would only have 4 parts: frame, slide, barrel, and locking block. As time would go on, the P1s would have fewer and fewer serialized parts, to the point that it just really was the slide and the frame. The locking block and then later the barrel would stop having serial numbers. They would still have proof markings, of course, but the serials would disappear, especially on the locking blocks, quite early. This was standard issue in the Bundeswehr. Actually, they were still ordering these up until 1992. And Walther would produce about 500,000, about 500,000 from 1957 through about 1994. Some were for the commercial market, some were for police contracts, but the majority were for the Bundeswehr. So quite a successful post-war life for essentially just a dural-framed P38. There were some issues, mostly with more modern ammo. These weren't made to fire hollow points, so as those came into use, some people complained that wanted to shoot hollow points at them, that they weren't reliable. Also, you just have to remember this is an alloy frame, so there's a certain side effects, especially with plus P when trying to do that. But it was a nice economy measure to give the West German military a good gun to keep on using. These have been coming into the USA for at least 15 years and have been quite reasonably priced. Even today, you can still pick one up for under 500, and for a long time, you could nab one for 300 or so. So it was a good way to get a P38 if you couldn't afford or find a wartime gun. And as a shooter, they're actually quite nice. I've always enjoyed mine, at least. Because of the lighter weight, there's a little more felt recoil, but because it's such an inline system with the straight back, I've always found it reasonably pleasant. Still have the decocker, double action. The trigger's a little different too, but than in the wartime. But there's a lot of small little changes you can check out if you're interested. That is the P1. Moving on. In the 1960s, German police were mostly equipped with 32 caliber, sometimes 380 caliber guns, whereas the military used 9mm. The 32 was sufficient for police use at that time. However, by the 70s, with the rising political tensions, communists and other protests, of course, just terrorists were starting to be better armed with more elaborate, more military type weapons. Also, they started to acquire some body armor, and 32 wasn't always cutting it, either for range or penetration. So it was decided around 1973 by the police that they would kind of get rid of the 32s and go to 9mm as their standard. Now, they actually went between two different 9mm originally, 9mm Parabellum, which won out, and 9mm Ultra, which became known as 9mm Police, which is a story in a different video for the Walther PP Super. However, the 9mm Parabellum, as I said, won, and so everyone was working on replacement guns to try to get military contracts. Walther was working on what would become the P5, HK had the P7, the squeeze cocker, and SIG had the P225, the P6. These would be the ones that were most used by the police. But these would not be ready for a few years. In the interim, Walther introduced the P4 in 1974. This is just a P1, but it has a slightly shorter barrel. We're at about 4 inches now. Still have the alloy frame. And it has a different safety system. Instead of having a decocker safety, we now just have a decocker only that's spring-loaded for caught back. Doot. And we're already back in. This was done for police use. They also bobbed the hammer a little bit, making it shorter, easier to grip, a little less likely to snag. They also removed the top plate. If you look back at the P1, it retains the top plate from the P38, which is a stamped piece of steel that covers the loaded chamber indicator, firing pin, so on and so forth. Well, they got rid of that with the P4. It's gone. We also got rid of the loaded chamber indicator. That pin is now gone. I guess they didn't want it sticking out and getting snagged either, or they just found it useless. The rear sight actually is attached with a screw, you can see here. A little bit different. And the front sight is the late wide style, which actually gives a white dot, a dot sight, which would be introduced later on the P1. Later production P1s from say 80, 81 onward would have the wider front sight. And of course it's just dovetailed in, so you could easily swap them out. So we're just, a little bit shorter, a little bit lighter. We have the later style rib trigger in this, which you see in the PP and PPKs. A little better grip for the police. Still takes the same mags. The mag well is unchanged. This has the fat slide. It has the reinforcing pin. In fact, these would be some of the first to be made with the reinforcing pin in the frame for better lifespan. This was a police gun at one time. This one is marked P4. This oval on the side is where the police crest, the marking was nicely machined off before being sold off as surplus. There was a commercial version imported by Interarms known as the P38 4, the P38 Roman numeral 4 IV, but not many came in. And these are only kind of a limited production, stopgap production before the P5 was ready anyway. Walther would only do about 8,000 of these. Not a tiny number, but not huge either. But this was their really first introduction to the police market, specifically firing 9mm parabellum. Kind of a neat gun. And then finally we have the P38K. And literally all this is a P4. It has the decocker only. Bobbed hammer. We have the rear sight held in with the screw, also no plate. Now this has a windage adjustable rear sight with a tool. That's because the front sight is no longer drift adjustable because it's mounted directly on the frame. And this to correspond with a further bobbed barrel. We're down to really as short as we can get it. If you look here, this is how much they bobbed off. Quite a bit. It's got about a 2.5 inch barrel, maybe even 2 1/4. This was done for police needing a very compact, concealable P4. It was introduced really around the same time. They were both coming in on the scene in the 74 to 75 time frame. A few of Germany's counterterrorism units would also adopt these, but only about 2,500 were made. While it is significantly shorter here to here than the P4, the grip is still full size, and as most of you know that conceal carry, the grip is really the hard part to conceal. And this has the full length grip with the full 8-round mag in it. I think if they had gone to, say, a 6-shot mag and lobbed off some of the grip, it would have been more successful. But we still have a very wide gun because of the dual recoil spring needing the wide slide. Again, it was another stopgap measure like the P4. So they did not sell that many or make that many, and I don't think they took it, I'm not going to say not seriously, but they knew what it was. Now, interestingly, there were always rumors of a P38K dating back to World War II. And while there probably were some prototypes, they never were in production. The P38Ks from World War II you find are basically fakes. Some of them will have the front sight still on the barrel. Some will have it located on the slide, but they're not real. The guns might date back to that period, but they weren't made originally with a short 2.5 inch barrel. They were still made with the 4.9 inch barrel. A lot of other people will take the P1 and bob it down, because that gives you the alloy frame, but you still can tell these easily because they'll have the safety decocker, not the spring-loaded safety only, or decocker only. And they will have the loaded chamber indicator. This one has a phosphate finish. Some are blued. This was another Interarms import. They were the folks for Walther back in the day. And this was really the last in the whole P38 series. Again though, these were produced in very small batches, but they were produced on and off from the mid-70s through the early 80s. So that's not a bad service record for the P38. First prototypes that led to it being made in 35, and then kind of the final versions in 39 to 40. Served in one form or another in the military until the fall of communism, really to the beginning of the 21st century is when it was really pulled out of West German Bundeswehr service. Austria, it served for a very long time before being replaced in the 80s and early 90s by the Glock. And of course it was quite commercially successful. Interarms sold a number of the Walther P38 tap guns in the US for many years. In more recent times, many imports have come in. There was actually a large batch a few years back from East Germany that were in really nice shape. They had been refinished, but they were refinished properly. So that was a good one. There's also the Russian Capture P38s, which have that dip blue, and sometimes force match numbers, and of course they'll have the X on them. So P38s have started to come into the country in larger numbers in recent years. The imports have kind of ended now, but for a few years there, you could really find some interesting variations. And of course, Century brought over a lot of the P1s when the Bundeswehr was done with them, and you could find some interesting variations there, including ones that had the early P38 mark slides. So definitely the P38 story did not end with World War II. It really kind of ended when high capacity IE guns, in this case over 8 rounds, really in the gun world, when the single stack guns you'd usually have 7 to 8 round mags, sometimes 9, and then when you go to the double stack you would start to introduce 13, 14, 15 and so on. That was really the end of it, and of course Walther introduced the P5 and later the P88 and so on and so forth. Well, I hope this was not too boring. I just wanted to wrap things up with the post-war guns because I think they're quite neat. I really like the history of these Grey Ghosts. Oh, the thing said about these being found in a submarine pen is complete marketing BS. They're just, but like I said, these P4s, the police surplus ones, if you were imported, again, they're easy to tell apart from the commercial ones. And of course, there's a large number of P1s because of so many being made for over 3 decades. Well, if you'd like to talk about your own P1 or P38 or P38K or anything, please do so in the comments. We love a nice discussion. If you like the video, please click like. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please click the link and check out our Patreon page. This is Misha, and we'll catch you next time.